Hello, everybody. So how many of you have got very enthusiastic about a developer tool, gone to the website and found that the documentation doesn't work, the tool doesn't work? Not more? Okay, well, you're obviously all working for projects yourself, and then you just get bored and pissed off and leave. Yeah? It's a common experience. So the topics of developer experience, which is a kind of a new emerging field, and developer relations is about focusing on trying to make your project actually usable for developers. And why? Well, the more usable your project is, the more developers will use it, hopefully the better tools they will build, and hopefully more end users. And that is something that the blockchain space needs. Let's be blunt. So if we were making a better tool chain all the way down, maybe we would have more end users in the long run too. So in this presentation, we're going to focus on some of the other things you could and should be doing around building a tool to make it actually nice for a developer to use. Obviously, we're going to cover a lot just in overview. We're going to, I think probably every one of these subjects could be a separate presentation. So if you want to talk more detail about anything that we talk about here, then please come up to our booth and we're happy to talk endlessly about any of these subjects. So this is some of the things we're going to talk about. Everything from community management to promoting your project to developers, to focusing on developer experience, which is not just documentation, but a lot of documentation. Communicating what you're doing, and then measuring if it's actually been successful in the first place is also important. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Andreas for the first part.
Hi. So first, I'm just going to set some of the context on the Web3 ecosystem, because communities in Web3 are a little bit different to communities in Web2. Several projects are just dealing with developers, particularly developer tools, but even some developer tools are creating a user and token ecosystem on top of that, which requires a little bit of extra nuance. And Zeppelin would be one example of that as well. So this is what many of us think our Web3 communities look like. It's an even balance of developers, token holders, and users. But often the way it ends up looking is we've got a much smaller pool of developers who aren't necessarily users or token holders, a slightly, hopefully, bigger group of users, and a lot of token holders if you started off with the token launch, and that brings in some extra nuance. So in the past year, obviously, given crypto winter, the value decline has made it a little bit harder to manage that portion of the community. And we're going to talk a little bit later about tactics, especially communication tactics, to differentiate between your audiences. And then we're going to focus on the kind of one of the most productive audiences that you can have, which is your developer community. Because they can contribute to your actual code base. They are your first users if you have developer tools, and can be your biggest advocates as well. End users, right now there have been some challenges around active users, especially on onboarding and awareness in the overall community. Looking ahead, initiatives like UX are going to be more and more important. So it's good to see that this year there are more sponsors who are actually focused on that area and not just the back end or middleware. And another thing to do with end users is obviously celebrate them, learn from successful campaigns, and share those with other communities. So there's this one great group, which I'll give a shout out to, which is called Community of Communities. And it's got a lot of the community managers and developer relation leads within the Web3 ecosystem. And they will open source their knowledge to each other and share best practices. For example, successful ambassador programs and so on. Then the community which this talk is really focused around is the developer community. In the Ethereum community, we have an extremely positive atmosphere, especially around events like this, which are focused on biddling. We are of the perspective that let's not just focus on building for the sake of building, but want to coin this term of solving. So you need to be solving a problem for your community, and then focus on the developer relations and getting it into more hands, more people's hands, right? And a key component, and I've done a lot of interviews with developer community leads within the Ethereum ecosystem. One big learning here is just be hyper-focused on the metrics so that you're getting feedback loops of what's working with your community. So overall, what can help your project? There are a few key areas here. So first, there's developer relations, which is really helping developers find you, helping developers use you. Then it gets into developer experience, which is really making reference documentation extremely accessible and efficient. Having different types of content which achieve different goals with the developer, which Chris will speak more about. Community, so that's a lot of sharing successes, sharing what people have built with whatever you've put out there, developer tools, SDKs, if it's your own chain, whatever it might be. Developer marketing, which is actually bringing more people in and getting more awareness. And then strategy and metrics, which is how we can tell if we're being successful through all of those efforts above, right? So one of the things we like to do at Kauri is spend a lot of time learning from what's worked well in Web 2 and what can we apply to Web 3 developer communities. And you see very different models by different projects, right? So on the kind of more engaged side, you've got Google or Twilio or Slack who have teams of 20 to 30 or even more developer advocates, evangelists, relations. On the other end, it can just be an open source tool with no, if you don't have the resources, no official developer relations team, right? Or it can be more informal. And you see this happening a lot in the Ethereum community with more meme-based communities, more informal interactions, just interacting through a Gitter and so on. And then partnerships can also be super effective in Web 2, like Stripe, for example, is really good at this, right? You see Stripe on a lot of other portals or developer resources. So also from our interviews with a lot of DevRel leads in the Ethereum community, there are a few key what to do's. So if you have a technical community, have a technical community manager who can actually answer the questions at the low level, really engage people, help them when they have questions, and foster that conversation so that it's not just putting things out there and expecting people to build on it. And it's helpful that it's not always the core developers who are doing that, because it's more important for them to build and focus on building. Then second, if you're still pre-product, no point in sponsoring an event like this. We heard it time and time again. A lot of teams, especially ICO teams, feel like they've wasted a lot of money on sponsoring big events before they could actually get a testnet, a tool, a beta, whatever it might be, in developers' hands. And then third, focus on key metrics. And it's really important to also iterate, experiment, figure out what is resonating with your users, what's working for them, and then adjust, right? And Martin Ture of Zeppelin actually has a really good quote: always be skeptical of your metric, because you're not seeing the full picture. So you need to go beyond the metric and actually speak to the users, the developers, get that feedback, build it into the product roadmap, right? And then I'll hand over now to Chris, who's going to speak more about the developer experience and exactly how you can build it out.
Thanks. Hopefully I'm going to upset a few developers in the room now, and that's kind of the point. Let's see. So, I mean, we all know what user experience is. It's making something that's usable for your end users. And developer experience has been an emerging field, this sort of DX field, I guess the past couple of years. There's even conferences that cover this now. Kind of crosses over technical writing and documentation, but also a few other fields. And to be blunt, we're often putting our presence on the web. The web doesn't just have to be text. We can actually do a lot more to bring developers into a project. So there's going to be a lot of things behind these bullet points. So let's dig in a bit. So for the sort of clickbaity start, I'm going to start with the 3 W's: the who, what, and the why. This is a bit of a cliche, but this is very important to think about in the first place. Who is looking at your tool? What are they trying to do, and why are they trying to do it? And bear in mind that if you're, so I actually use, I've been doing technical writing and developer relations work in mostly in the kind of more traditional, shall we say, open source community. So I have one of the examples of a company that does this, not necessarily the best, but well, to cope with different user groups is Docker. I'm guessing if most developers in the room know Docker. You don't have to know it, but it's a very technical tool, but it also helps people who run projects, who run businesses, etc. So if you look through their communication, you will see that at a very top level, it just explains to people why it's useful. At a kind of second tier, it will talk about technically the benefits it's going to bring to you. And then at the developer level, it will explain how to get started, how to get something running. So this is the same very technical project, but with 3 different levels of communication. So this is important. The who, what, and why will be different at different levels. If you are just a tool hosted on GitHub, that's a JavaScript library or something like that, then probably most of it's going to be one user base. But if it's a tool that you want to kind of be more widely adopted into enterprise or company users, then there are also people who sign checks and make business decisions who also want to understand it, but in a different way. So the person that you're aiming at will change in different places. And hopefully, if you are doing your business planning in a proper way, you've already answered a lot of these questions at some point. But it also counts to the developers too. Okay. And then assume nothing is going to be the one that I really think, if you want to remember something and write it down to take home, it's going to be this one. We all know this, we all kind of know that we should assume nothing, but actually this probably goes a lot deeper than we may think. So firstly, every time you release a new version of a tool, test it on vanilla machines to see if those dependencies that you think every developer must have installed, actually, do they? So always test on vanilla machines to see if the steps really work for someone just starting out. And likewise, the developer community is becoming more diverse now, and this is a good thing, but this also means that not everybody that is looking at your tool comes from the same education background as you, the same knowledge background as you. So again, don't assume that just because you know a piece of knowledge and how something should be done, that everybody knows that. Just, it sometimes gets, I know it can get a little tedious to begin with because you just think, I'm just repeating myself a lot, but it will really help everybody in the long run and get the actual, I mean, the overall positive of doing all these steps in the long run is less support calls and less support tweets and Telegram chats and all these sorts of things which free you up time to do other things. So all these steps will help you focus on what you actually want to be doing anyway. Okay, the next point I'm going to drill into is refining your concepts. I personally believe, and I am a wordsmith, so I'm going to be maybe have a little bit more sort of experience of doing this, but I actually really think that every project, no matter how complicated you think it is, can be explained in an elevator pitch. This is a sort of startup term for a 3-minute pitch when you're in an elevator with someone. And I would challenge you that if you think that's not the case, then find someone who can help you. Because really, everything can be abstracted to very broad general terms. And of course, you're losing a lot of detail, but that can come later. And this helps you then answer these questions at the top, in that the people who just want to have a rough idea of what it is in a few seconds will get their idea. The person who wants to dig into a bit more detail gets their idea, and et cetera, et cetera. So really work on refining those concepts. And I'm going to come into a little bit more detail about how you could try to do that in a minute. The next point is onboarding. So not every tool needs onboarding. Onboarding is kind of the concept of maybe you need to create an account. I mean, in our space, it's things like keys, which is still difficult, and we're still figuring that out. But a lot of developer tool companies have quite good onboarding experiences. So I'm going to refer to some Web 2.0 examples because it's probably easier right now for them to do this, and then you can think how you could apply this in our ecosystem. So for example, you can create a tutorial that has a getting started piece of code zipped up in an archive file, pre-populated with all their user access details, commented throughout the code, so someone can read the code, see code comments, follow along the documentation, and they have something nice and in sync that they get to play with immediately whilst also looking at the instructions. For example, there's also a tool called Pusher, which is a JavaScript messaging tool. They have a very nice onboarding where you actually could go to the website, create something in your terminal, and the website starts sending your terminal messages. It's small, it's simple, but instantly you're getting feedback into this is doing something, and it brings someone in straight away. And a lot of this feeds into the assume nothing too. If it takes someone 20 minutes of pain playing around with dependencies and conflicts and timeout issues, then you've lost them, I'm sorry. And finally, this sort of leads nicely into the last point, is that docs can't fix everything. If your tool is slow, buggy, badly architected, not well tested, there's only so much you can fix that in documentation, and maybe it's time to actually think about fixing the code first. I know it's a much more long process than just writing about it, but it's also a good point. I think that the creator of Perl said that I can't remember the exact quote, so I'm probably going to butcher this, but the best tool is something where someone doesn't have to look at the code. And it's kind of the reverse of this, in that if your tool is really usable, they shouldn't need to look at the docs. So it's sort of, somewhere in the middle. Okay, so what can be documentation? And as I go through each of these and explain why these might be useful, I'm also going to remind you that I said a few slides ago, not all documentation has to be text. We can have video, we can have GIFs, we can have interactive playgrounds like JS Fiddle and things like that. Docker, as I mentioned earlier, is a wonderful tool for in the background spinning up an environment that someone reading your documentation could interact with. When they're done, that's taken away, and the next person who comes along has the same thing. Obviously, it takes time to set this stuff up, but if you're focused on your users, then this is all good in the long run. So the words that we use to kind of divide these types of documentation are not necessarily set in stone. It's more about what they're trying to do. So getting started is getting started. An introduction, a very quick, easy, couple of minutes overview that pretty much anybody could follow, have something working at the end of it, and then think, hey, I like this, I'm going to look further, or hey, no, this isn't what I was looking for. Probably actually the hardest one to do, because getting it right is quite difficult. Then we have our reference docs. This might be API documentation, it might be SDK code, it might be just protocol reference. What the reference is it's kind of like laying out the toolkit. This is a hammer, you use it to hit things. This is a saw, you use it to cut things. And then the getting started is like here's how you hammer a nail and saw some wood to build a shed, kind of thing. Explanation and guides sort of cross over a little bit in terms of explaining to people some common scenarios where they might want to build these tools together to achieve something. If you have a JavaScript library, then it may be integrating it with React, for example, things like that. And structure is an important one in many ways, in that I also hate to disappoint you, and this is a talk I do a lot with technical writers, is you spend all this time writing your content, and not everyone reads it. Has anyone ever read documentation from start to finish? No, you look around, you jump around, you Google, you search, you come back, etc., etc. So never assume that people are following things from start to finish. Always make sure there are jump-off points between important things that people need to know. And this also goes down to the page. Good HTML structure and good markdown or restructured text structure, whatever you're using to create the documentation, is important too, not only for a person reading a page, but also for search engines. So bear that in mind. Your readers are not all humans, they are also robots. Finally, on kind of actually the content, the actual more detailed content of the documentation, this is something that I do entire workshops on, so trying to cover it in one slide is pretty difficult, but I'm happy to go into more detail with you if you want. Consistency is important. A lot of these things are small changes, but every small change you make, especially if you're writing in English, for example, which may not be your first language, to a reader who also is reading in their second language, every little thing you can do to make the experience of reading simpler and less of a kind of mental strain will help. So if you decide that you use the term framework instead of library, stick to framework. Things like this. Just use the same terms repeatedly. Language is a very big subject, but there's a lot of small things you can do that I'm happy to share that are very quick fixes to improve the reading experience. And I will drop some words here for you to look into. Things like active versus passive voice. Things like reducing future tense. This is all like grammar nerdery, but I'm happy to go into more detail. And there are tools to help you with this. You don't even have to know what you're doing. So and secondly, keep it short and keep it on point. There's a great quote that is misquoted to many, many people. If I had more time, I'd have written a shorter letter. Writing on point and short is hard. Waffling endlessly is much easier, as I'm doing right now, I think. Keep on point. People just want to come to your documentation, achieve something, and leave. They don't care how smart you are and how long you've spent building something. They just want to use it. And bear that in mind. So with that, I will pass back to Andreas.
Yeah. So kind of looping back to the overall communication strategy, and this is where we think about audience a lot, right? And being quite selective of channels. So a lot of the feedback that we've gotten through the Web3 community managers is, for investors, Telegram and website is the best. So most investors are used to using Telegram. Just keep them where, go to them, create a channel for them where they're used to being. And then the website can answer more evergreen questions. Then for end users, blogs, which look a little bit more like there's more activity coming because you see the dates of the new postings and so on. A helpful website for content which is going to persist for a longer time. And then events, actually interacting with the end users, having a two-way conversation, super important. Developers, again, similar to investors, go to where developers are. GitHub, forums are far more effective than communications channels. So things like Discourse have proven to be much more effective than things like Discord or Slack or Telegram. Because in a forum, you actually have that thread which persists rather than having to scroll up 1,000 messages to find something which is long, long gone, right? And then almost a more persistent version of forums and a better version which can be more curated is knowledge bases. And that's also where Kauri is focused. And it's enabling the community to not just contribute, so you can have multiple contributors. The burden isn't just on you as the core developer, you can contribute and so can the community, but many people can also collaborate on curation as well, organizing it into structures which are easily readable, going back to Chris's point. Then almost one of the most forgotten but most important areas of community and developer relations is measuring the impact. How do you know if you're actually having success? And it depends on where you are in your project lifecycle. If it's just starting out and you've just got something out there which you want people to know about, the top of the funnel is the most important, and that's awareness. There are many ways to understand awareness. It can be kind of, if you've got content on the web, it's going to be monthly uniques. If it's a tool which you've made available open source, it might be things like GitHub stars or number of people watching that repo. Acquisition is people who are taking the next step beyond awareness. So either signups or downloads, installs, whatever it might be, make sure that you're tracking them and seeing how they change on a week-to-week or monthly basis. Then activation, how much engagement are you getting from those users? Are they downloading the next release? Or are they installing the next release? Are they making contributions to your repo if it's an open source repo? Something which a lot of the strongest projects in this space track carefully is things like issues, because that means you know that people are working with your code and they're actually helping you out by identifying issues. And PRs, of course. Then retention, what's continued use of the platform? This can be really hard to measure, especially in Web3 when we don't have API keys. But there are some people who are working on innovative ways to test this. One of the most basic things that we can do is just look at number of interactions with the smart contracts, because that is on-chain and readily available, right? Then in some cases, it's going to be revenue from transaction fees, from subscription, whatever it might be. That's definitely a part of the funnel. And then referral. How many people are linking back to you? How many people are writing about how to use your tools, your SDK, whatever it might be? That's a really good way about understanding, okay, someone liked this library, they wrote a tutorial about how to use it in a certain context and then posted that. That's a really good referral. And then finally, product. Taking all of the feedback you're getting at different points, refining the product, and having that positive feedback loop. Then when we think about building the team and the DevRel team, there are a few different skill sets that you can look for in the person that you're hiring. And the general wisdom is to pick 2 out of 5, because unicorns don't exist. And if you need all 5, then maybe you need 3 people. But public speaking can be an important component of DevRel. It's working on things like awareness. It can also be working on things like education to improve engagement. If you release a new feature, tell people about it so that they can use that new feature beyond just the core tech, right? Technical writing and tutorials is a much more cost-efficient way of improving awareness and engagement, because that content persists, especially if it's indexed appropriately and cross-posted to multiple places. And that's something which we're happy to talk to you more about. Then community building and people skills. These are online communities, in-person communities, equally important and can be weighted more heavily in one direction or another, depending on what you're doing. And then events, organizing your own events. Truffle just had TruffleCon. A lot of sponsors are here sponsoring Denver, because this is a great way to get in touch with users, developers. And then people who actually build stuff, they can contribute, they can mock up a quick demo, they can make it come alive for other developers and inspire them and have more creativity. And that goes to the last type of content which Chris was talking about, which is guides, sometimes also called tutorials, and demos are super important here. So in summary, think about who your users are, differentiate those communications, and build an engagement plan around that type of user. Build holistic teams, but don't expect unicorns. Then if you are building a community, collaborate with other community managers and also give back. If something worked really well, let people know how you did it so that they can replicate that and so that we can bring more developers into the Web3 ecosystem together. And then learning from Web 2. Kendall, who's also on the Kauri team, is going to be giving a talk at FCC, which is all about learnings from Web 2.0 and how we can apply that to Web 3. Another really good web resource for that is DevRel.net. They've got tons of great content. And then always remember, DevRel, DX, don't forget about it. It'll remain on the side stage for a long time, but it's one of the most important things that you can do to get good engagement from your community and really ensure usage. So thank you, everyone. Are we out of time?
Okay. I think we can take 1 or 2 questions, or just come and see us at the booth. I don't know.
Yeah. If there is a question, there's a microphone at the front. Otherwise, we are running a little bit short. Perfect. Thank you for listening. Come say hi. We're at the Kauri booth, which is just at the top of the stairs.